President Cyril Ramaphosa has characterized his visit to the Russia-Africa summit last week as meaningful and an engagement that exceeded his expectation. Now, Ramaphosa also held a bilateral meeting with his Russian counterpart, President Vladimir Putin, focusing on issues of common interest. The Russian president told the gathering of more than 40 heads of state that trade with African nations had expanded, growing by almost 20% in the last 7 years. So to discuss the significance of this visit in more detail, with me, Isaah Mhlanga, the Chief Executive Economist at Alexander Forbes. Thanks so much for coming through this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start here. I was reading somewhere, and I forget who said this now, but someone was tweeting and saying, you know, China has a plan for Africa, Russia has a plan for Africa, the US has a plan for Africa. Everybody seems to have a plan for Africa. Does Africa have a plan for Africa?
I think we discussed that with a fellow economist last Friday at the Reserve Bank, that it almost seems as if Africa has no plan for itself or for other regions. As you mentioned, Russia, China, at least the US has withdrawn a bit from Africa, which is in line with Donald Trump's nationalism, but also in line with what you see in the UK with Boris Johnson moving out of the EU. So perhaps this gives Russia an opportunity to show that leadership role, to say, as the US and the UK look inwards, it has to look outwards. And Africa is one of those continents which will prove to be the last frontier, as it is being called, given its population is over 1.3 billion people, but also it offers massive opportunities for growth.
So if we look at this summit, you know, Russia seeking closer relations with Africa and African nations, individual nation states, what does that mean for South Africa per se?
I think for South Africa for now it's still very small in terms of trade. If you look at Russia's imports from the African continent as a whole, it's just under $30 billion, and most of which is concentrated within the North African states. Nigeria and Algeria are those two countries that constitute over 2/3 of the imports that come from Africa. So from an economic point of view, it still constitutes a smaller proportion if you compare with the likes of France, for instance, or even China, with over 200 billion in terms of investments into the continent. So from that perspective, Russia still plays a very small role. But if you look at other aspects, for instance, security, where Russia sells arms to a number of African countries. If you look at Central African Republic, it has a base. But also, if you look at its intention to scale up its nuclear reactors, which is renewable energy, that at one point within our own country it was a big talking point. It has managed to put on stream over 6 nuclear plants across different countries, but that is a far lower number to what the intended number was, which was about 16. So it just tells you how difficult this has been. But also, those power plants, they have been accompanied by massive corruption, which is a concern that is normally raised against Russia.
So when President Ramaphosa says the engagements were meaningful, they exceeded his expectations, what's the significance of that? What does that mean?
I think just before the summit started, there was one of the biggest military aeroplanes that landed at Waterkloof in Pretoria, which was a first for Russia to actually fly such a plane into African continent. But I guess the more important thing is to show cooperation, to show multilateralism, which the US and the UK are moving out against, which is a position that South African authorities have always held, to say a global economy with multilateral institutions is a better one rather than looking inward. Obviously, you need to diversify your source of investment that comes into the country. It's largely dominated by Western countries, but also much more recently, you see China's involvement in Africa has increased quite dramatically. But you also need to diversify away from the traditional suppliers of investment. So Russia offers that opportunity for us.
And this, of course, for Russia, against the backdrop of 1% economic growth back home.
That's quite important, given that it's under sanctions from the US. So for Russia itself as well, it's also an opportunity to diversify sources of growth by improving where it can import in or where it can export to. But for South Africa, there's one other opportunity. Look for agriculture, for instance. We still export very little to Russia in terms of agricultural exports. Exports to Russia that come out of the African continent, as far as agriculture is concerned, it's only about 28 billion. And we are number 29th on the list, which means we have an opportunity to improve our exports to Russia, which will benefit the agricultural sector.
What would those opportunities be?
Well, if you look at what we export or what Russia imports from the rest of the continent, largely fruits and not so much on grains, because Russia does have a lot of wheat. But we export quite a lot of fruits to the UK, which is also now moving backwards in terms of moving out of the EU. So we may see some decline in terms of what we're likely to see our export growth into the UK. So it offers us an opportunity to divert some of those exports into the Russian market.
Now, speaking of, import-export, we saw the landing of those 2 Russian bomber jets at Waterkloof Air Force Base. And again, within the context of global geopolitics, should we be reading anything into this? Are there other, countries sitting, looking at this and thinking, what's going on?
I think the more important aspect for Africa is the Africa Free Continental Trade Area. To what extent will signing deals bilaterally with individual countries such as Russia will undermine that trade agreement going forward? Because it will have to be agreed upon by all countries in Africa, which means if countries sign bilateral deals directly, it may even undermine the common trade area in future. So I think that is one aspect that African countries have to check, but also the issue that in most cases where you see Russia go into a particular country, there are risks that come because it normally comes with an establishment of some security or military presence in the country, which has been proven in other countries that it is quite destabilizing. Obviously, there have been some allegations that the Russian government has been, funding both sides of conflict in some of the other countries. I think that's one thing that most countries they need to watch for.
And how is this likely to affect, and will it affect at all, for example, our trade relations with countries such as the United States?
Not so much. I don't think it will affect as such, because I'm not aware of any major deals that were signed, at least at this summit. But the relationship with Africa and Russia, they date very long time. The end of colonialism in most African countries, or even apartheid in South Africa, where Russia supported many of the liberation movements across Africa as they gained independence. So that is not disputed. And I think it's a long relationship that existed way before the investment that you see by the West currently. So I don't think it's going to impact to a larger extent because it has existed for a long time before.
And of course you touched on it, but let's just go back to the whole issue around the nuclear deal. Now, we know that during the Zuma administration, this became, a huge bugbear where people felt that maybe those deals were not, that they were not open and transparent enough. But looking at what is being discussed now, because I do understand the issue of the nuclear deal did come up, what should we be reading into it right now against what you said earlier of maybe the scale of it is reduced? But that nuclear deal, is it not still a case of, we made some agreement, we had some agreement with Russia, and therefore we have to see it through to some extent?
I don't think there was an agreement as far as government pronouncement has been. There wasn't any agreement. But also, if you look at the scale that it was proposed initially, over 1 trillion rand in terms of the budget. But if you look at the integrated resource plan that was published a few weeks ago by Minister Gwede, it has a very small, nuclear plays a very small component. The bigger proportion is really wind energy, it's gas, which combined constitute about 20,000 megawatts, which means we are not in the same environment as we were before, and more likely it's going to be much more transparent going forward, which reduces the risks that were there previously. But also, given our fiscus, it was not going to be affordable at the time. I think that was more the issue rather than the renewable energy in terms of nuclear itself.
And just finally, with regard to BRICS, because we've seen the Chinese coming into the continent, quite forcefully. Now you have Russia calling this summit, more than 40 heads of state, gathered there to talk business with Russia, which is another BRICS nation. Is there a proliferation here towards, doing business with BRICS countries at the expense of others, would you say?
I think for South Africa it makes sense. You are already in partnership under BRICS, which means you already have some understanding of how do we manage our trade relationships. So China is investing quite heavily across the African continent under the One Road, One Initiative, One Belt Initiative. So it wouldn't be out of ordinary for Russia to also come and establish trade relationships that are quite strong, that benefits all countries. So from that perspective, it still talks to the multilateralism that has benefited a lot of countries in terms of globalization, improving growth, which is quite opposite to what the US and the UK has been doing.
Well, let's leave it there. Thanks so much, Isaah Mhlanga, Executive Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes, discussing the benefits of the President's visit to the Russia-Africa Summit in relation to South Africa's economy. Let's take a break.